Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for an Agatha Christie filled with intrigue and suspense, brought to you exclusively by the The Curious Case channel, narrated by Dr. Rami. This mystery will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to subscribe. Tonight's feature, The Phantom's Pact, is a gripping original detective story that weaves together myth, deception, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Inspired by the age-old legends of tricksters and lost souls, this narrative draws an eerie parallel between ancient folklore and the modern enigma of a vanished woman whose disappearance defies all logic. The original myth speaks of a spectre bound by an unfulfilled promise, haunting the paths of those who dare seek it. In our tale, the brilliant yet tormented investigator Adrian Blackwood finds himself unraveling the threads of a case that mirrors this legend, where a woman much like the Phantom is seen but never found, pursued but never grasped. The story delves deep into the psychological battle between perception and reality, as Blackwood must confront not just the physical clues, but the shadows of the past that seem to whisper secrets only he can hear. This story is a testament to the art of suspense storytelling, blending classic themes with a razor-sharp modern twist, promising a narrative that will linger in your mind long after the final word is spoken. And now we present to you The Phantom's Pact. The Silver Lantern Inn had not welcomed its unexpected guest with open arms. The moment Adrian Blackwood stepped inside, brushing the snow from his coat, a subtle tension seemed to settle over the dimly lit establishment. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with weary eyes, had hesitated before offering a room, subtly suggesting that the local garage could provide a vehicle for Mr. Blackwood to resume his journey without delay. The investigator, however, dismissed the notion outright. Why should he hire a car when his own, a meticulously maintained St. James Phantom, sat just a mile away, stranded but still his? He had no intention of leaving it behind, nor of braving the worsening blizzard until morning. With a steely glance, he demanded a room, a fire and a meal. The landlord, after exchanging an unreadable glance with his wife, grudgingly led him to an upstairs chamber and summoned the chambermaid to light a fire. Downstairs, murmured discussions began, whispered concerns crackling like embers in a dying hearth. An hour later, Blackwood reclined in a battered armchair, feet stretched toward the glowing fireplace, the warmth slowly seeping back into his bones. The meal had been at best a test of endurance, meat tough as leather, vegetables robbed of any flavor, and a dessert that might have been an insult to both apples and custard alike. Even the coffee, a sludgy bitter concoction, was barely drinkable, and yet, sitting by the fire, thawing from his frigid ordeal, he found solace in the simple act of being warm. The howling wind outside whispered secrets through the wooden beams, rattling the windows as if something unseen lurked beyond the glass, watching. He took a slow sip of the coffee, forcing himself to ignore the unpleasant taste, when a sudden knock at the door shattered the moment. The chambermaid, a quiet girl with an air of unease, stepped inside. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried an odd hesitation. "Sir, the man from the garage is here. He says it's urgent." Blackwood arched an eyebrow. Urgent? A mere car repair hardly warranted urgency. He set the cup down, its dull thud against the wooden table punctuating his thoughts. "Send him up," he said evenly. The girl nodded, but as she turned to leave, he noticed it, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her gaze flickered toward the hallway, as though afraid of something lurking in the shadows. She hesitated a fraction too long before stepping out, and Blackwood, now fully alert, watched the door close with an unsettling finality. He exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the armrest. A mere mechanic's visit should not feel like the prelude to something ominous. And yet, as the slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the staircase, a cold sense of foreboding settled over him, like the weight of an unseen presence in the room. There was a knock, distinct, hesitant, a different knock. Adrian Blackwood straightened in his chair, his sharp eyes flickering toward the door. "Come in," he called, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. The door creaked open, revealing a young man standing awkwardly in the doorway, his cap twisted nervously in his hands. For a moment Blackwood merely observed him, the firelight cast shifting shadows across the youth's features, highlighting a strikingly chiseled face, handsome in a way that seemed almost out of place in the grim setting of the inn. Broad shoulders, strong jaw, and clear blue eyes that flickered with unease. He had the look of a man who belonged in the pages of an ancient legend rather than a dimly lit snowbound inn. The young man's voice, low and hoarse, broke the silence. "About the car, sir, we've brought it in, found the trouble, shouldn't take more than an hour to fix." Blackwood nodded slowly, but he wasn't truly listening. There was something about this young man, something carefully restrained, barely concealed beneath the surface. What was wrong with it? He asked, more to gauge a reaction than out of genuine curiosity. The mechanic plunged into an explanation, his words spilling out with eager technical detail. Blackwood, feigning interest, nodded along, but his mind was elsewhere. His first impression had been purely aesthetic, an appreciation of the youth's near-statuesque perfection, but now a second thought took hold, sharpening his instincts. The slight hitch in the man's voice, the way his fingers gripped the fabric of his cap, twisting it just a little too tightly. Nervousness. Strange, Blackwood murmured, his voice thoughtful. "My driver told me much the same thing." A flush crept up the young man's cheeks, his hands tightening further around the cap. Yes, sir, I know." Blackwood's gaze didn't waver. "And yet," he continued smoothly, "you thought it best to come tell me yourself." A flicker of something, reluctance, guilt or perhaps fear, crossed the young man's face before he gave a short nod. "I thought I should," he mumbled. "How very conscientious of you." Blackwood's voice was light, almost amused, but beneath it was something sharper, something probing. The words carried a quiet finality, a polite dismissal, and yet, as he expected, the young man didn't leave. He remained rooted to the spot, his fingers convulsively crushing the fabric in his grasp. Then, after a moment's painful hesitation, he spoke again, his voice even lower than before. "Sir, excuse me, but it's true, isn't it? You're the detective gentleman. You're Adrian Blackwood." He pronounced the name with careful precision, as if rehearsed. Blackwood tilted his head slightly. "That is so." The young man swallowed. A deep red crept up his neck, his face now taut with something between nervousness and desperate resolve. "I read about you," he blurted. "In the papers." Blackwood said nothing. He simply watched. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The youth shifted from foot to foot, struggling against his own reluctance. His distress was palpable, and then, finally, the dam broke. "I know it's an awful thing to ask, sir, but you being here by chance, just like this, it's too good an opportunity to miss. I told myself, there's no harm in asking, is there?" His voice rushed now, as though fearing he'd lose his nerve. "I need your help, sir." Blackwood studied him carefully. "You want me to find something?" A deep breath, then a small tight nod. "Not something, sir. Someone." His voice faltered, raw with emotion. "It's about a young lady. She's disappeared." Blackwood sat forward slightly, his sharp investigative mind snapping to attention. His gaze darkened, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like the glint of a blade. His voice, when he spoke again, was precise, measured. "Tell me everything. I could help you, perhaps." "Yes," Adrian Blackwood said, his sharp eyes studying the young man's uneasy stance. "But the proper people for you to go to are the police. This is their job. They have far more resources at their disposal than I do." The boy shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening around the edge of his cap. "I can't do that, sir," he mumbled. It's not like that. It's all rather peculiar, so to speak." Blackwood's gaze didn't waver. He observed the tension in the young man's posture, the slight tremor in his voice. Then, with a deliberate motion, he gestured toward the chair across from him. "Very well," he said. "Sit down then. Tell me your name." "Williamson, sir." "Ted Williamson." "Sit down, Ted, and start from the beginning." Ted hesitated, for only a moment before pulling the chair forward and perching on the edge, his posture stiff, his fingers clenched. His expression carried that peculiar mix of hope and desperation, like a stray dog, uncertain whether it would be offered a meal or a swift kick. Blackwood's voice was steady, reassuring. "Tell me everything." Ted took a deep breath, his words spilling out in bursts. "Well, sir, it's like this. I only saw her once, just once, and I don't know her real name, nor anything about her really, but it's strange, the whole thing, the way she vanished, my letter coming back unopened, and he shook his head as if trying to clear it. I don't know, sir. It just doesn't sit right. Start from the beginning, Blackwood instructed. No rush. Tell me everything, as it happened. Ted exhaled sharply, gathering his thoughts. You ever heard of Ashbridge Manor, sir? Big house near the cliffs. I know nothing about it. Well, it belongs to Sir Reginald Fairfax. He's one of those society types, always throwing parties, always has a house full of guests. A proper grand affair it is, with all sorts of people, actresses, musicians, you name it. A lively place, always something happening. He shifted in his seat, rubbing the back of his neck. It was last summer, June. The house had some trouble with their telephone line. Storm knocked it out, so they called up the repair shop, and my boss sent me over to take a look at it. Blackwood nodded. When I got there, the guests were all out, boating I think, or maybe at some fancy luncheon in town. The only ones left in the house were the cook, the old butler, and a lady's maid. His voice softened slightly. She let me in, showed me where the telephone was, and she stayed while I worked. Blackwood watched him closely. And, Ted's lips pressed together for a moment, as if trying to suppress something. When he spoke again, his voice had a distant quality. Her name was Elodie, or so she told me. She was French, I think, spoke English well enough, but with an accent. She was. He hesitated, a faint smile playing at his lips before he continued. She was different, bright-eyed, quick with a laugh, not like the other staff I've met. She had a way about her, like she wasn't meant to be just someone's maid, like she was meant for something more. Blackwood's gaze remained steady. And you asked her to meet you again? Ted gave a short nod. Aye. She said she couldn't. Not that night anyway. Said her lady would need her. But then she said they'd be back in a fortnight, and that maybe then. He trailed off, his fingers tightening on the arms of the chair. I waited for her. Same place, same time, but she never came. His voice grew quieter. At first I thought maybe she'd forgotten, or maybe changed her mind, but something didn't feel right. So I went up to the house, asked after her. The Russian lady she worked for was there just like before, and they did have a lady's maid, but when they called her down, it wasn't Elodie, it was someone else entirely. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a woman who looked at me like I was dirt under her shoe. He swallowed hard. I asked about Elodie, asked if she had worked there before, if maybe she'd left, but they acted like they'd never heard the name before, like she never existed. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his voice low and measured. And you were certain that she did? Ted looked up at him, eyes flashing. Of course I'm certain. I spent an afternoon with her. I spoke to her, walked with her. She was real. His voice faltered, but it's like she just vanished into thin air. A heavy silence settled between them. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then finally, Blackwood spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. I believe you. Ted let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You do? Blackwood's gaze sharpened, the embers of intrigue lighting behind his eyes. Yes, and I believe this mystery is far from over. Marie, she called herself, a sharp-eyed woman with a sly smile, the kind that saw more than she let on. She tilted her head, feigning interest as she appraised me. You wanted to see me? She asked, her voice dripping with something that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, the question catching in my throat. The moment I laid eyes on her, I knew this wasn't the same girl, not by a mile. And yet, here she stood in the very place where Elodie had been, looking at me as if I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. You're the Russian lady's maid? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I was expecting someone else. The girl I met before. She's not here anymore. Marie's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, she said, twirling a loose strand of hair between her fingers. You must mean the last one. She was sent away. Suddenly, I stiffened. Sent away? Why? She shrugged in that careless way people do when they know more than they're willing to share. Then with an exaggerated stretch of her arms, she gave me an innocent look. How should I know? She said smoothly. I wasn't here then. Something in her tone told me she was lying. But before I could press further, she had already lost interest, waving a dismissive hand and turning away. I left the manor that evening with more questions than I'd come with. Elodie, gone. No one willing to say where. And Marie, she knew something. I was sure of it. Determined, I went back to see her again. This time I had a plan. I didn't mention Elodie's name. Instead I played along, pretended I was just some foolish boy pining over a passing fancy. And Marie, she was the kind who wouldn't do anything for free, but she would for the right price. A few whispered words and a promise of a generous gift later, she handed me a slip of paper, an address. North London. I left that night with my heart hammering in my chest, my fingers gripping that crumpled piece of paper like a lifeline. This was it. This was the lead I needed. I wrote to Elodie the very next day. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but I had to try. I told her I had been waiting, that I needed to know she was all right, that I would come to her if she wanted me to. Days passed, then a week, then two, no reply. And then the letter came back, sealed, untouched, the words scrawled across the front in bold, unfeeling ink. No longer at this address. That was when I knew. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had erased her. I looked across the table, locking eyes with Adrian Blackwood. His expression was unreadable, his sharp gaze studying me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You see how it is, sir," I said quietly, my voice hoarse. "This isn't something I can take to the police. There's nothing for them to investigate. No crime, no missing person report. Just a girl who was there one day and gone the next." I swallowed hard. "But I need to find her. I have to, and I don't know where to start." I hesitated, my pride warring with my desperation. Then in a lower voice I added, "I've got some money put aside. It's not much, maybe £5, 10 if needed. If you could help me." A silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. Then Blackwood leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "We need not discuss the financial side just yet," he said. His fingers tapped thoughtfully against the polished wood of the table. "What we must do first is uncover the truth." And just like that, I felt a spark of hope flicker to life, because for the first time since she vanished, someone believed me. And maybe, just maybe, I was one step closer to finding her. "First consider this," Blackwood said, his voice measured, calculated. "This girl Elodie, she knew your name, where you worked." Ted Williamson nodded, gripping the edge of the chair. "Oh yes, sir, she knew." Blackwood's gaze sharpened. "Then she could have reached out to you if she had wanted to." There was a pause. This time Ted answered more slowly, as if turning the thought over in his mind. "Yes, sir, she could have." Blackwood leaned back, fingers steepled. "Then have you considered the possibility?" Ted interrupted him, his voice tight, defensive. "You're saying she didn't care for me the way I cared for her, that I was just another fool who fell for a pretty face." His jaw tightened, but then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, sir. Maybe she didn't love me the way I loved her. Maybe she wasn't planning a future with me, but I know this much. She liked me. It wasn't just a bit of fun to her. There was something real there." His voice dropped, eyes darkening with something that looked a lot like fear. "And I've been thinking, sir, maybe there's a reason for all this. Maybe she wanted to reach out, but she couldn't." He hesitated, then added in a whisper, "She was mixed up with the wrong people. I could feel it. Something about that house, those people she worked for. It wasn't right." Blackwood watched him carefully. "You mean she might have been in trouble?" Ted swallowed, then nodded. "Trouble of what kind?" Blackwood asked. There was a beat of silence before Ted spoke again, his voice lower now. "I don't know, sir, but whatever it is, it wasn't what you were thinking. Not that kind of trouble. There wasn't anything like that between us." He flushed, glancing away. "I'd never have done anything to put her in that kind of situation." Blackwood observed him, his expression unreadable. Then in a softer voice, he murmured, "And even if she was caught in something dangerous, you still want to find her." The fire returned to Ted's face, his eyes burning with unwavering determination. "Yes, sir, I do. No matter what." He sat up straighter, as if bracing himself. "I want to marry her, if she'll have me. And it doesn't matter what kind of mess she's in. None of it matters. I just need to know she's safe." A small smile played at the corner of Blackwood's lips. He muttered to himself, almost absently, golden hair like wings. Yes, I do believe this might be a task worthy of pursuit. His eyes gleamed as he leaned forward. Very well, Mr. Williamson, let us uncover the truth. A flicker of hope crossed Ted's face, because for the first time, someone was willing to believe that Elodie was more than just a passing shadow, and somewhere hidden in the depths of this mystery, she was waiting to be found. Detective Blackwood studied the crumpled slip of paper, the ink slightly smudged from Ted Williamson's nervous grip. The name and address scrawled upon it offered the only lead they had. Miss Valletta, 17 Upper Renfrew Lane, Nard 15. Would this be the key to unraveling the mystery of Elodie's disappearance? Somehow, Blackwood doubted it. Yet, when all you had was a thin thread, you pulled it, and hoped the whole tapestry came undone. Upper Renfrew Lane was a weary-looking street, rows of narrow soot-streaked houses standing like silent sentinels under a drab sky. No, 17 bore the same weary look, its paint peeling, its doorstep cracked, its curtains drawn as though hiding secrets within. He knocked. The door creaked open, revealing a stout woman, her heavy-lidded eyes dull and bloodshot, as if she lived in a world where mornings came too soon, and nights never truly ended. Miss Valletta, Blackwood inquired smoothly. The woman sniffed, already starting to close the door. Gone, long time ago. Blackwood slid a polished shoe into the narrowing gap, halting the movement with quiet insistence. Perhaps you know where I might find her. The woman's lips pursed. Couldn't say. She didn't leave no address. When did she go? Last summer it was. Blackwood shifted his weight, his fingers playing idly with 2 coins in his palm, their metallic chime an unspoken proposition. The woman hesitated. Then, as though moved by unseen forces, perhaps the friendly persuasion of currency, her face softened. Well, now that you mention it, July, early July, left in a hurry, she did. No goodbyes, no forwarding address, just up and vanished. Said something about going back to Italy. She was Italian, that's right, dark as midnight, she was, sharp as a whip too. Worked as a lady's maid to some dancer, a Russian woman I think. Blackwood's eyes sharpened. Madame Semolina, that's the one, danced at the Thespian. A real star she was, always on those theatre posters, all dressed up like some foreign queen. Blackwood paused. Do you know why Miss Valletta left so suddenly? A flicker of hesitation crossed the woman's face. I couldn't say, she murmured, but her tone suggested otherwise. She was dismissed, wasn't she? The woman exhaled through her nose, rubbing her hands together. Might have been a bit of a dust-up now that you mention it, but Miss Valletta wasn't the kind to gossip. Oh, she was fuming though, stormed in here with a face like thunder, muttering in that fast Italian of hers. Wicked temper she had, the kind that makes you wonder if she wouldn't sooner slit a throat than shake a hand. Her chuckle was uneasy, the memory still lingering in the dim hallway, like a shadow refusing to be chased away. Blackwood gave a slow nod. One thing was certain, Miss Valletta had left in haste. The question was why, and more importantly, where was she now? Detective Blackwood let the silence stretch after the stout woman's final words. She was telling the truth, at least as much of the truth as she was willing to part with. Miss Valletta had left in haste. No address, no trail, gone like smoke in the wind. And yet, something didn't add up. The name weighed on his mind as he left the dimly lit doorstep of 17 Upper Renfrew Lane. He had dealt with enough disappearances to know that people rarely vanished without a reason, and Miss Valletta, by all accounts, a woman with a fiery temper and sharp instincts, was not the kind to simply slip away unnoticed. There was more to this, and Blackwood intended to find out what. The next lead took him to Ambrose Vandel, a man whose dramatic flair rivaled the grand performances he designed. As a celebrated set designer, Vandel knew everyone worth knowing in the world of theatre, dance and high society. His studio was an explosion of color, fabrics draped over gilded chairs, paintings half-finished on easels, chandeliers dimmed to cast just the right mood. The smell of oil paint and stale cigarettes lingered in the air. Sanderfield, George Sanderfield. Vandel's hands fluttered expressively as he perched on the edge of a chaise lounge, one leg crossed over the other. Nasty fellow, filthy rich but utterly rotten, if you ask me. A crook, though no one dares say it outright. Always some scandal lurking in the shadows, But an affair with a dancer? Oh darling, of course he did. Blackwood leaned forward. Katrina Samoshenko. Vandal clasped his hands together in delight. You must have seen her. Katrina, too divine. Her swan of Tuonela. She became the role, pure poetry on stage, and La Bichau Bois, Debussy, or was it Menine? No matter. She danced it with Michael Novogin. He's marvelous, isn't he? Such an artist, such presence. And she was close to Sir George Sanderfield. Blackwood pressed. Vandal sighed, dramatically flicking a stray thread from his silk lapel. Oh yes dear, they were quite the pair. Weekends at his grand estate by the river, parties, extravagant, scandalous parties, a place where masks were worn, both figuratively and literally. If you wanted excess, if you wanted mystery, if you wanted danger, that was the place to be. Blackwood absorbed the information. Could you introduce me to Mademoiselle Samoshenko? Vandal scowled, shaking his head. Oh but my dear, she isn't here anymore, vanished. Paris, they say, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. It was all very sudden. His voice lowered conspiratorially. And you do know the rumors, don't you? Blackwood raised an eyebrow. What rumors? Vandal leaned in, his voice hushed but rich with intrigue. Some say she was a Bolshevik spy. Not that I personally believe it. People love a good story. But Katrina, she played the part well. Claimed she was a white Russian daughter of a prince. Or was it a Grand Duke? Always the same tale. A tragic past. A lost title. It makes for such an exquisite fantasy, don't you think? And the audience, oh they adored it. Blackwood nodded slowly, letting the weight of Vandal's words settle. A dancer wrapped in secrets, a powerful man known for his shadows, a lady's maid who vanished without a trace. The threads of the mystery were tightening, and Detective Blackwood was ready to pull. Vandal, ever the self-indulgent artist, momentarily forgot the conversation's direction, and drifted back to the all-consuming subject of himself. Now, as I was saying, he purred, adjusting the silk scarf draped over his shoulder, if you truly want to capture the essence of Bathsheba, you must steep yourself, completely immerse yourself, in the Semitic tradition. I express it through. Blackwood tuned him out. The detective had learned long ago that Vandal's artistic tangents could spiral endlessly. Instead he was already thinking ahead, assembling the scattered pieces of the puzzle in his mind. A woman vanished in haste, a powerful man with secrets, a world of performances where illusion was reality. Sir George Sanderfield was next. Arranging a meeting with the elusive financier had taken some maneuvering, but Blackwood finally found himself in the dimly lit drawing room of Sanderfield's town home. It was the kind of place that reeked of wealth, not ostentatiously so, but with a quiet, calculated confidence. Heavy velvet drapes swallowed the daylight, and the air carried the faint scent of cigars and aged brandy. Sir George Sanderfield was precisely as Blackwood had pictured him, broad, thick-necked, the kind of man who had clawed his way to the top, and ensured he stayed there. There was something in the way his sharp, dark eyes darted across the room, that suggested a man who always considered an escape route. Well, Mr. Blackwood, what can I do for you? Sanderfield's voice was measured, his expression neutral, but there was an unmistakable stiffness in his posture. We haven't met before, have we? No, Blackwood said evenly. We have not. Sanderfield gave a short laugh. Well then I'm quite curious. What's this all about? Nothing too complicated, Blackwood said, his voice deliberately light. A simple matter of information. Sanderfield leaned back slightly, relaxing his shoulders, but not too much. Ah, I see. Looking for a bit of inside knowledge, are you? Didn't know you were interested in finance. Blackwood smiled faintly. This is not a matter of business. It concerns a certain lady. For the first time there was a flicker of something behind Sanderfield's eyes. It was barely perceptible, but Blackwood had seen it too many times to miss it. An instinctive tightening, a moment of calculation. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Oh, Sanderfield said, exhaling with what seemed like relief. A woman. He eased into his chair, adopting a more comfortable position. Well, that's a different matter entirely. You were acquainted, I believe, with Mademoiselle Katrina Samoshenko. Sanderfield's laugh was smooth, too smooth. Yes, he admitted, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. An absolutely enchanting creature. Passionate, a true artist. And she has left London. So it would seem, Sanderfield said, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest. I believe there was some kind of dispute with the management. She was temperamental, you know. That classic Russian intensity. Did she tell you she was leaving? Blackwood asked. Sanderfield waved a dismissive hand. My dear fellow, I wouldn't know. These dancers, artists as they like to call themselves, come and go as they please. I haven't kept in touch. No idea where she might be now. His words were casual, too casual. Sanderfield stood, an unmistakable signal that the conversation was over. I'm afraid I can't be of much help to you, Mr. Blackwood, but do let me know if you ever want to discuss something more profitable. Blackwood remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch just enough to make Sanderfield uncomfortable. Then, with a polite nod, he rose. He hadn't gotten much, but he had gotten enough. Sanderfield knew more than he was letting on, and Blackwood intended to find out exactly what. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on Sir George Sanderfield. But it is not Mademoiselle Samoschenka that I am anxious to trace. Sanderfield, who had just begun to relax, tensed again. It isn't? He asked, his voice just a shade too casual. No, Poirot said, his tone as light as ever, though his gaze missed nothing. It is a question of her maid. Her maid. The words escaped Sanderfield before he could stop himself, and for the first time a flicker of real alarm passed over his face. It was brief, quickly concealed beneath a mask of indifference, but Poirot had already seen it. You do, perhaps, remember her maid? Poirot asked smoothly. Sanderfield let out a short, forced laugh and waved a hand dismissively. Good Lord, no. Why should I? He shifted in his chair. I remember she had one, of course. Bit of a bad lot too, if you ask me. Sneaking little thing. Prying. The type who listens at keyholes and whispers in corners. If I were you, I wouldn't trust a word that girl says. A born liar. Poirot's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Ah, he murmured. So actually you remember quite a lot about her. Sanderfield's eyes darkened. His fingers drummed lightly against the polished armrest of his chair. Just an impression, that's all. His voice was carefully measured now, his words chosen with precision. Don't even recall her name. Marie something or other. No, I'm afraid I can't help you track her down. Sorry. Poirot inclined his head. I appreciate your concern, Sir George, but you need not worry. I have already obtained the name of Marie Helen from the Thespian Theatre, along with her address. Something changed in Sanderfield's posture. His fingers, which had been tapping, suddenly stopped. But Poirot continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming almost conversational. Marie Helen is not the one I am looking for. He leaned forward ever so slightly. I am speaking, Sir George, of the maid who was with Mademoiselle Samoschenka before her. I am speaking of Nita Valletta. For the first time Sir George Sanderfield did not answer immediately. A muscle tightened in his jaw. His expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a slight hollowing at his temples, a tautness in his shoulders that had not been there before. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped. Don't remember her at all, he said flatly. Marie's the only one I recall, little dark-haired thing with a nasty look in her eye. A silence stretched between them. Poirot merely observed him, saying nothing. Sanderfield shifted again. I told you, I can't help you, he added, his voice just a touch too full. Poirot nodded, but his gaze lingered on the man's face, as if reading something beyond his words. Oui, he said softly, almost to himself. You have been most informative, Sir George, more than you realize. Then, with a polite smile, he rose to his feet, leaving behind a room that suddenly felt much colder than it had a moment ago. Poirot's voice remained calm, yet there was an unmistakable sharpness in his words. The girl I mean was at your house, Grasslawn, last June. Sir George Sanderfield stiffened slightly. Well, all I can say is I don't remember her, he muttered, his tone turning sulky. Don't believe she had a maid with her. I think you're making a mistake. Poirot's sharp gaze remained fixed on him. Oh. Non, monsieur, he said softly. I do not think I am mistaken. A flicker of irritation crossed Sanderfield's face. His fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. I can't help you, he said shortly. I don't remember any maid. Poirot merely inclined his head slightly, as though he had expected this response. Later, in a dimly lit cafe, Poirot sat across from Marie-Helen. Her small intelligent eyes darted toward him, then quickly away again, like a mouse testing the air for danger. "But I remember perfectly, monsieur," she said in smooth, measured tones. "I was engaged by Madame Samashenka the last week in June, her former maid. She departed in a hurry." "Hurry?" Poirot repeated, his voice light, but his eyes sharp. Marie-Helen nodded. "Yes, suddenly, without notice. One day she was there, the next, she was gone. It may have been illness, something of that kind." Madame did not explain. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Did you find your mistress easy to get on with?" The girl gave a slight shrug, her expression neutral. "She had moods. Ah, but you understand, monsieur. This is how it is with dancers. They live in their emotions. One moment, she would be laughing, full of life. Like the sun shining after a storm. And then suddenly," Marie gestured with her hands, her dark eyes momentarily clouding, "she would collapse into despair. No words, no food, nothing, just silence, as though she carried some great weight inside her. It was not natural." "And Sir George?" Poirot asked. Something flickered in Marie's expression. Her head tilted slightly. Sir George Sanderfield." There was a new sharpness in her tone. Her lips curled in a sly smile, and for a moment her eyes gleamed with something dark and knowing. "That is what you truly wish to know?" "No," she said slowly. "The other questions, they were just the opening moves, like a chess game. But Sir George," she leaned in, lowering her voice, the scent of her perfume curling through the air like something decadent and dangerous. "I could tell you curious things about him, monsieur. Oh yes, very curious things indeed." Poirot did not react. His face remained still, unreadable, as though carved from marble. Then, just as Marie's excitement sharpened, he spoke, calm, dismissive. "It is not necessary." The effect was immediate. Marie's mouth hung open for half a second before she quickly shut it, her expression shifting from intrigue to frustration. There was a flash of anger in her eyes, her moment of control slipping away. "I always say you know everything, Alexis Pavlovitch," she muttered, more to herself than to Poirot. Poirot merely smiled, small, knowing, unreadable, and in that moment he knew Marie-Helen had been expecting him, and she was not the only one with secrets. Hercule Poirot murmured the words with his most flattering intonation, his eyes reflecting a quiet persistence. He was thinking to himself that this third labor of Hercules had proven far more arduous than anticipated. What had begun as a simple matter of a missing lady's maid had turned into an intricate labyrinth, a puzzle where every promising lead dissolved into nothing. Each door he opened led only to another corridor of questions, and now this relentless pursuit had brought him to the dimly lit velvet-curtained world of the Samovar restaurant in Paris, a place thick with cigarette smoke. Here, amid the faded grandeur of Russian exile, Count Alexis Pavlovitch ruled like a self-appointed king, a man who prided himself on knowing every whisper and scandal of the artistic world. The Count, his plump fingers adorned with heavy rings, nodded now with a complacent smile, his small eyes gleaming with knowledge. "Ah, mon ami, you ask me where she has gone, the little Samashenka, the divine creature, the exquisite dancer." He kissed his fingertips theatrically. She was the real thing, that one, not like these imitations, these pretenders who twirl and flutter, but have no soul. No, she had the fire, the abandon, the passion that could set a stage ablaze. His voice dropped into a melancholy sigh, and he spread his hands wide, as if lamenting an inevitable tragedy. "But fire can burn too quickly, n'est-ce pas?" He shook his head. "She would have gone far, première ballerina, no doubt about it. But then suddenly, it ends, just like that." He snapped his fingers, his thick rings flashing in the dim light. "One day, she is the star of the stage. The next, poof, she vanishes, like mist in the morning." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And where, mon cher comte, did she vanish to?" Pavlovitch gave a dramatic sigh, leaning back into his chair, his silk waistcoat straining against his ample stomach. "Switzerland, Switzerland," Poirot repeated, a frown creasing his brow. "Yes, Vargre les Alpes." The Count exhaled, shaking his head as though mourning some great tragedy. "It is always there that they go, those with the little dry cough, the ones who grow thinner and thinner, until they disappear altogether." He lowered his voice to a whisper. his fingers tracing a slow invisible cross over his chest. "She will die, my friend. She has a fatalistic nature. It is written in her eyes. She will surely die." A heavy silence settled between them, the distant strains of a gypsy violin swelling in the background. Poirot, ever practical, broke the moment with a sharp cough. He had no time for theatrical fatalism. He wanted facts. He wanted truth. And something in Pavlovich's words told him that he was now very, very close to it. "You do not, by chance, recall a maid she had, a maid called Nita Valletta?" "Valletta? Valletta?" Count Alexis Pavlovich stroked his chin, his thick fingers moving slowly over the edge of his jeweled ring. His eyes flickered with the effort of recollection. "Yes, I remember seeing a maid once, at the station, when I was seeing Katrina off to London. A nervous little thing, always glancing over her shoulder. An Italian, from Pisa, was she not?" His forehead creased, and then he nodded, more certain now. "Yes, I am sure she was an Italian, from Pisa." Hercule Poirot exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "In that case," he murmured, straightening his cuffs with deliberate precision, "it seems my next journey must take me to Pisa." The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ancient stones of the Campo Santo. The air smelled of damp earth and wilted flowers, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the surrounding marble tombs. Hercule Poirot stood motionless, gazing down at the simple grave before him. Here, this was where his search had led him. Beneath the mound of earth lay the girl who had unknowingly become the center of a tangled mystery, the one who had danced on the edges of a world far beyond her reach, a flickering memory, lost now to time and fate. Nita Valletta, gone. For a long moment Poirot did not move. He had followed her shadow across continents, chasing whispers and elusive names, only to find that she had been laid to rest before he had even begun his search. Was it fate that had silenced her, or something far more deliberate? A gust of wind stirred the dried petals of a forgotten bouquet, scattering them like fallen hopes. And yet, even in death she remained untouched by the cruelty of the world. To the young man who had adored her she would live on as he had seen her, bright-eyed, laughing, untouched by the pain of disillusionment, the chasm of class and culture that might have torn them apart. Perhaps Poirot thought with a rare touch of melancholy, this was the gentler ending, the one fate had chosen. He shook his head slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him. There were still questions unanswered, mysteries yet to unravel, but for now, in the quiet hush of the ancient cemetery, there was only the finality of the earth and the whispers of lives lost too soon. Poirot turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking softly against the worn stone path. The case was far from over, but for Nita Valletta, the story had reached its end. His mind drifted back to the conversation with the Valletta family, the memory unfolding in sharp, vivid fragments. The mother sat with her hands wrung in her lap, her broad peasant face weathered by grief, yet oddly resigned. The father stood stiffly beside her, his strong, sun-hardened hands clenched into fists at his sides, his grief expressed not through tears but through a silence so rigid it felt unbreakable. And then there was the sister, dark-eyed, hard-lipped, her expression a mask that revealed nothing yet hinted at too much. "It was sudden, Signor, so very sudden," the father had said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Though for many years she would complain of pain, nothing serious, we thought. But then he gestured helplessly, his hands momentarily opening before falling back to his sides. "The doctor gave us no choice. He said an operation was needed immediately, appendicitis," he claimed. "There was no time to wait. They took her to the hospital at once." And then, Poirot had prompted gently. The mother had sniffed, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Under the anesthetic, Signor. She never woke up, never even knew what happened, just gone." The sister, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. Her voice was cool, detached, but her fingers twisted the fabric of her skirt in a slow, deliberate motion. "She was always clever, Bianca, smarter than people thought. It is cruel that she died so young. Died young." The words lingered in Poirot's mind long after he had left their modest home. That was the message he would carry back to the young man who had pleaded for his help. "She is not for you, my friend. She died young. The wind curled through the ancient streets of Pisa, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and the first fragile blossoms of spring. The leaning tower loomed in the distance, its silhouette a silent observer of the centuries, of tragedies and mysteries long buried beneath its gaze. The sky stretched above it, pale and endless, whispering promises of renewal and life. And yet, Poirot hesitated. A single thread of doubt wound itself around his thoughts. It was not grief alone that unsettled him, but something deeper, something nameless. The way the story had been presented to him, too perfect, too seamless, too convenient. Every piece fitted too neatly into place, as though arranged by careful hands. A phrase, a name, a detail his mind refused to release. Had he been led here deliberately? Had he been meant to find this ending, to accept it without question? Poirot sighed, shaking his head. No, he could not leave it like this. There was one more journey he had to make, one last piece of the puzzle that refused to settle. He must go to Vaudreuil-les-Alpes, and there perhaps the true answers awaited. Here, he thought, truly was the world's end, a place where time held its breath, where the wind whispered secrets to the mountains, and where the sun, though bright, could never quite chase away the cold. This desolate plateau of ice and snow stretched endlessly, dotted only with wooden huts, small shelters where fragile human lives clung desperately to existence. The stillness was almost unbearable. Inside each dimly lit room, a soul battled an invisible enemy, the insidious hand of death creeping ever closer. And so at last he came to Katrina Samoshenka. The woman before him was but a shadow of the creature she had once been. The fire that had once burned in her limbs, the electricity that had once charged her movements, gone, leaving behind an ashen shell. Her cheeks, now sunken, bore two bright spots of fevered red, the cruel illusion of health. Her long slender fingers, delicate even in decay, lay motionless on the coverlet, thin as the wings of a dying moth. Yet something stirred within Poirot as he looked at her. A memory, half-formed yet insistent. He had not recalled her name at first, but now, yes, now he remembered. He had seen her dance. He had been enchanted by her. No more than that. He had been transported, swept away by an artistry so pure it had obliterated the awareness of art itself. Michael Novgin, the hunter, his powerful leaps, the hypnotic spin of his body against the surreal dreamlike landscape of Ambrose Vandel's stage, and she had been the hind, the golden untouchable creature, always just beyond reach, eternally pursued, eternally untamed. He could still see her, twinkling bronze feet flashing beneath her, the graceful tilt of her horned head, the wild, desperate beauty of her flight, and then her final fall. The gunshot echoing through the theater, the stunned silence that had followed as she collapsed, her body limp, her wings clipped forever, and Michael Novgin, the hunter, standing frozen, his quarry, his desire, lifeless in his arms. A performance. And yet, as Poirot stood now in this frozen tomb of a world, he could not escape the sense that the play had never ended, that the hunt in some form had continued beyond the stage, beyond the lights and applause, that the real collapse had only just begun. Katrina Samoshenka's eyes flickered open, their depths dulled by exhaustion, but still harboring a glint of the old spirit. She regarded him with faint curiosity, her voice little more than a whisper of breath. "I have never seen you before, have I?" she murmured. "What is it you want of me?" Poirot bowed his head slightly, his manner gentle but unwavering. "First, madame," he said, "I wish to thank you for your art, which once gifted me an evening of beauty." A faint smile touched her lips, a ghost of the woman she had once been. But beauty, Poirot knew, was often the greatest illusion of all, and behind it, there was always a truth waiting to be uncovered. "But also, madame, I am here on a matter of business," Poirot said, his voice calm but edged with quiet insistence. "For a long time, I have been searching for a certain maid of yours. Her name was Nina." The reaction was immediate. Katrina Samoshenka's body stiffened slightly, though she made no sudden movement. Only her eyes betrayed her, a flicker, sharp and startled, as though something had slipped past her carefully maintained composure. Her hands, frail and motionless just a moment ago, trembled slightly on the blanket. "Nita," she repeated. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, as though the mere utterance of the name conjured something from the depths of her memory, something not meant to surface. Poirot inclined his head, watching her keenly. "Yes, madame. What do you know about Nita?" She hesitated, just for an instant. Then carefully, she said, "What do you know about her?" "I will tell you." Poirot's voice softened, taking on the cadence of a storyteller, as he recounted the evening when his car had broken down by a lonely roadside. He spoke of Ted Williamson, the simple, honest mechanic with rough hands and a stammering voice, who had stood in the dim light, twisting his cap in nervous fingers, pouring out his heart. He spoke of the love that had bloomed in a fleeting summer, of the pain that had followed when the girl vanished, leaving behind only unanswered questions. As he spoke, Katrina listened, her pale face unmoving, her breath almost imperceptible, yet Poirot could see it, the faintest tightening of her lips, the briefest flicker of something behind her eyes. When he had finished, she exhaled slowly, her gaze unfocused. "It is touching that," she murmured.
"Yes, it is touching."
Poirot gave a small nod. "A tale of Arcady, is it not? A story as old as time, innocence, love, loss. But tell me, madame, what can you say of this girl?" Katrina Samoshenko sighed, a long weary breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I had a maid, Juanita. She was lovely, yes, young, full of laughter, light of heart." A pause, then softly, "It happened to her as it so often happens to those the gods favor." Poirot's breath caught slightly. Those words, he had spoken them himself once before, and now they came back to him, echoed in another voice, a final irrevocable truth. "She died young." A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Yet Poirot persisted.
She is dead?"
he asked, watching her closely.
"Yes,"
she said, and this time, the word came more quickly, as if she had prepared for it. "She is dead." For a long moment, Poirot was silent. The weight of the words settled in the room like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. And yet, something was wrong. The tale fit too neatly. The pieces clicked together with too much precision, too much finality. And Poirot was a man who had spent his life unraveling truths hidden beneath layers of deception. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "There is one thing I do not quite understand, madame." Her eyes flickered toward him. "I asked Sir George Sanderfield about your maid," Poirot continued, "and his reaction was unusual. He was afraid. Now why would that be?" A flicker of something passed over Katrina's face, and then there it was, a slight downturn of her lips, a barely perceptible curl of distaste. "You said a maid of mine," she said with a trace of impatience. "Sir George thought you meant Marie, the girl who came to me after Juanita left." Poirot remained still. "Marie, yes," Katrina said, her voice edged with scorn. "She was an odious girl, inquisitive, always prying into letters, locked drawers, things that did not concern her. She tried to blackmail Sir George once, I believe, over something she discovered about him." A small bitter smile curled her lips. "She learned too late that some doors are meant to remain closed." Poirot studied her, considering the weight of her words. A maid who disappeared, a nobleman who flinched at the mere mention of her, a dancer whose eyes betrayed more than her lips ever would. Yes, there was more to this story, much more. And Hercule Poirot did not intend to leave without uncovering the truth. Poirot murmured, almost to himself, "Then that explains that." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his sharp gaze fixed on Katrina. He was a patient man, and patience often yielded the greatest truths. But even now something did not sit right. The pieces fit together too neatly, and he had learned long ago that the most elegant lies were often the most dangerous. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but unyielding. "Juanita's other name was Valletta. She died of an operation for appendicitis in Pisa. That is correct?" A flicker, a hesitation so brief that a lesser observer would have missed it. But Poirot was not a lesser observer. The pause, however minuscule, was there, hovering in the space between his question and her response. Then slowly Katrina bowed her head. "Yes," she said, "that is right." Poirot clasped his hands together. His tone was thoughtful, meditative. almost as though he were speaking to himself. And yet, there is still a small point, an inconsistency perhaps. Her family, when I spoke to them, did not call her Juanita, they called her Bianca. Katrina shrugged, a deliberate practiced gesture of indifference. Bianca, Juanita, does it matter? She said lightly, though her voice had an undertone of something darker. I suppose her real name was Bianca, but she thought Juanita was more romantic, so she chose to call herself that. Ah, you think that? Poirot's voice was mild, but his eyes were sharp. You believe this is the explanation? There was another pause, then his voice changed, became softer, lower, yet edged with quiet certainty. For me there is another explanation. Katrina's fingers curled slightly against the blanket. What is it? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead he leaned forward, just a fraction, his eyes never leaving hers. The girl that Ted Williamson saw, he said, had hair like wings of gold. He reached out, almost imperceptibly, and with the lightest touch, his fingertip brushed against the two curling waves of Katrina's golden hair. Wings of gold, or horns of gold. It depends, does it not? It is all in how one chooses to see you, whether as angel or as devil. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost reverent. Or perhaps they are only the golden horns of the stricken deer. For the first time, Katrina's gaze faltered. A shiver passed over her, as though Poirot had peeled away something carefully constructed, something fragile. Her lips parted, and in that same hushed tone she echoed, "The stricken deer." Her voice was hollow, emptied of all resistance. Poirot continued, his words as precise as a scalpel. From the moment Ted Williamson described her, something troubled me, something stirred in my mind, a memory, faint, distant but persistent. It was you, mademoiselle, you dancing on your twinkling bronze feet through the wild forest of the stage. The image has been with me ever since. He leaned closer still, pressing forward, forcing her into the moment of reckoning. Shall I tell you what I think? His voice was almost kind, yet unrelenting. I think there was a week when you had no maid, when you went down to Grasslawn alone, because Bianca Valletta had already returned to Italy, and you had not yet engaged a new girl. You were already unwell, though perhaps you did not realize it fully then. You stayed behind when the others went on an excursion, and when there was a knock at the door, you answered it yourself. A beat, a breath, the world holding still, and there standing before you was a young man, simple as a child, handsome as a god. Poirot's voice softened, but his words were like the turning of a key in a locked door. And you, mademoiselle, you wove a dream for him. You were not Juanita, you were something else entirely. You became incognita, and for a few hours, you walked with him in Arcady. The silence that followed was long and heavy, thick as the air before a storm. At last Katrina spoke. Her voice was hoarse, stripped of all pretense, all illusion. In one thing at least, I have told you the truth, she murmured. I have given you the right end to the story. A breath, a whisper, a confession. Nita will die young. Poirot sat back, watching her. He did not argue, did not press further. He simply let the weight of those words settle, because in the end, they both knew the truth, and the truth once uncovered, could never be buried again. Non. Hercule Poirot was no longer the quiet, methodical observer. In an instant he was transformed. The shift was sudden, electric, like a storm breaking the stillness of an oppressive summer afternoon. His small, precise hand came down hard upon the table, the sound sharp and final. His eyes, usually so measured, now blazed with something close to fury. It is quite unnecessary, he declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This fatalism, it is absurd. You need not die, mademoiselle. Others fight for their lives, do they not? And so can you. Katrina Samashenka flinched, just barely, as though the force of his words struck something deep within her. But then, slowly she shook her head. It was a weary movement, full of the weight of inevitability. What life is there for me? She asked softly. There was no anger in her tone, only a vast, aching emptiness. The words hung between them like a sentence already past. Poirot exhaled sharply. Not the life of the stage, bien entendu, he admitted. That life, it is finished. But my dear mademoiselle, do not tell me that is the only life worth living. His voice softened, but the urgency remained. Tell me, let us speak honestly now, Was your father truly a prince, a grand duke, a general of great importance? For a moment there was silence, and then, unexpectedly, Katrina laughed, a quick startled laugh, sharp as the crack of ice breaking. He drove a lorry in Leningrad, she admitted, her lips curving into something resembling a smile. Poirot nodded with immense satisfaction, as though she had just provided him with the final, irrefutable proof of a case he had long suspected. Very good, he exclaimed, and tell me, why should you not be the wife of a garage hand in some quiet country village? Why should you not live among simple people, where the air is clean and the days are long, where there is work and laughter and the scent of flowers in the spring? He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, almost coaxing now. And why should you not have children, mademoiselle, children as beautiful as gods, with eyes full of light, and with feet that perhaps, who knows, will dance as you once danced? A sharp breath escaped her lips. For the first time in a long time, something flickered in her gaze, not disbelief, not scorn, but the fragile trembling edges of something even more delicate, hope. But the whole idea is fantastic, she whispered, as though speaking the words too loudly might shatter the illusion. Poirot sat back, folding his arms with a look of great satisfaction. Nevertheless, mademoiselle, he said, his voice rich with certainty, I believe it is going to come true, and this time, she did not argue.